As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Woke culture has become so prominent in the American education system that it would not be surprising to learn that schools were replacing the once popular rhyme, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," with "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but opinions I disagree with can make me feel unsafe, so they must be silenced." Take the case of a 12-year-old Liam Morrison, a student at Nichols Middle School in Middlesboro, Massachusetts. This March, Liam was told to change his shirt or be sent home. School staff are reported to have said his shirt targeted a protected class. Liam says he was told his shirt was making some students feel unsafe. Did Liam's shirt advocate violence? No. Did Liam's shirt simply stated that there were only two genders? A free society cannot exist where a substantial portion of its population demands and receives protection from exposure to opposing ideas. If the history of authoritarianism teaches us anything, it is that those in positions of power are often willing to provide a frightened people with security as long as the people are willing to sacrifice their and their fellow citizens' liberty. Fighting the woke agenda is therefore not, as some libertarians claim, a culture war distraction from the pursuit of liberty. Instead, fighting the woke agenda is crucial to restoring a free society. Of course, this means working to roll back government power by, for example, shutting down the unconstitutional Department of Education and getting Congress to pass legislation forbidding government officials from telling social media companies to censor certain American citizens. We must also resist joining those misguided conservatives who are calling on the right to seek to use government power to impose a right-wing version of wokeness on the American people. The backlash against wokeness in schools is leading more parents to either become involved in their local school boards or to look for alternatives such as homeschooling. Parents who are interested in a homeschooling program that provides children with a well-rounded education that will help their child awake but not become woke should consider my homeschool curriculum. The Ron Paul curriculum provides students with a well-rounded education that includes rigorous programs in history, mathematics, and the physical and natural sciences. The curriculum also provides instruction in personal finance. Students can develop superior written and oral communication skills via intensive writing and public speaking courses. Another feature of my curriculum is that it provides students the opportunity to create and run their own internet businesses. The government and history sections of the curriculum emphasize Austrian economics, libertarian political theory, and the history of liberty. However, unlike government schools, my curriculum never puts ideological indoctrination ahead of education. Interactive forums allow students to engage with and learn from each other. The forums ensure students are actively engaged in their education as well as give them an opportunity to interact with their peers outside of a formal setting. I encourage all parents looking for alternatives to government schools, alternatives that would provide children with a well-rounded education that will allow them to learn about the history and ideas of liberty instead of pushing on them wokeness and the lies of the cultural Marxists. To go to ronpaulcurriculum.com for more information about my homeschooling program.
Ukraine says that drone attacks on Moscow will increase. So after 2 drones targeted Moscow early Monday, a Ukrainian military intelligence spokesman warned that such attacks on the Russian capital city will continue and increase in scale in a rare Ukrainian admission of responsibility for attacks inside Russia. So this is spokesman Andriy Yusov. He said this to the Kiev Post, quote, "The strikes on the key facilities of Russia's security sector located in Moscow testify to the fact that the Putin regime is unable to fully control the sky even for the protection of most important facilities. Obviously, this situation will continue and increase in scale," end quote. So Russian authorities said that the drones were downed with electronic warfare jamming systems, but one of them struck a business center in Moscow, shattering the high-rise building's windows. Moscow's mayor said that there were no casualties in the attack. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova called the drone attack an act of international terrorism. So there's also a larger Ukrainian drone attack that was launched on Crimea early Monday, with the Russian Defense Ministry saying that 17 Ukrainian drones were down. So quite a few drones were launched at Crimea. The head of Crimea said that an ammunition depot on the peninsula was hit and a private residence was damaged. So the Biden administration maintains that it does not enable Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, but that restriction does not apply to Crimea, as Washington and Kiev do not recognize the peninsula as Russian territory. The operations, of course, risk a major escalation, especially if Russia believes that the U.S. and NATO are backing these attacks. Russia has previously said that Ukrainian attacks on Moscow are not possible without U.S. support, so that's Russia's view. And the New York Times reported last month that the Biden administration is no longer concerned that Ukrainian attacks inside Crimea or inside Russia might escalate the war. So the damage Israel is causing to its support base in the United States is becoming more apparent. A very bright warning flare went up this weekend, appearing once again in the New York Times. This time it was columnist Nicholas Kristof, who took a much bolder and far less speculative step than his colleague Tom Friedman did last week by suggesting that the very heart of AIPAC's mission, annual military aid to Israel, should be phased out. So Friedman, this is even a big deal, that Thomas Friedman, if you're familiar with him, huge Zionist, supporter of Israel, liberal, big New York Times columnist, floated the idea of a reassessment of the United States' relationship with Israel. I think that's a bigger deal than Biden saying it. He said that it might be on the horizon. And, that's a big deal, but what was published on Saturday was a bigger deal. Kristof published this and quoted two former U.S. ambassadors to Israel saying that the U.S. should not give military aid to Israel anymore. And as Politnik says, it's a liberal Zionist argument for ending military aid to Israel. So Kristof's column strikes at the very heart of the lobbying might of pro-Israel forces and used noted liberal Zionists to do it. Former ambassadors to Israel Dan Kurtzer and Martin Idyk, probably pronouncing that wrong, and they're saying why they think it's a good idea to stop sending billions of dollars in military aid to Israel each year. So Israel gets $3.8 billion each year. And what they're saying is that this doesn't give the U.S. Really much influence on Israel's policies. And this is really over the fact that this judicial overhaul thing is going on. That's what has really upset these liberals. They really don't like the right-wing Netanyahu government that has these extremist settlers and ultra-Orthodox people in the coalition. So they had their big vote on Monday, and despite these huge protests, the Israeli parliament passed this new law. So this article is from Middle East Eye. Israel was hit by a political earthquake on Monday as MPs passed a law limiting the Supreme Court's power, one of a raft of judicial reforms critics say are turning the country into an autocracy. Ahead of the vote and after, thousands of protesters in Jerusalem blocked the roads leading to Israel's parliament, the Knesset, with police using water cannons to remove them. Thousands more gathered in Tel Aviv, with protests expected throughout the night. So MPs passed the bill by 64 votes to 0 after opposition lawmakers left the parliament in protest when compromise talks broke down. So this new law abolishes Israel's reasonableness standard, eliminating the Supreme Court's ability to block government decisions that it deems unreasonable. It's part of a package of bills proposed by the government earlier this year, which is seeking to overhaul the judicial system in the country. Proponents of the plan say it's necessary to restore the balance of power between government branches, while opponents say it will remove checks and balances and undermines the independence of the judicial system. So on Sunday, the deputy chief of the Russian Center for Reconciliation of the opposing parties in Syria reported the incident with the drone. He said, quote, "Of special concern is a near mid-air collision of a coalition's MQ-9 unmanned aerial vehicle with Russian warplanes near Al-Bab. Russian pilots once again demonstrated high professionalism and took timely measures to prevent collisions with the coalition's unmanned aerial vehicles," end quote. So he went on to say that the drones are activating their fire guidance systems on Russian planes, which automatically triggers the fighter jet's onboard defense systems. So this is definitely concerning that there's all these encounters. It's kind of an area most people wouldn't expect as a flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and Russia. Everybody would expect that to happen in Ukraine or the Black Sea or something. But this could, again, another area that could easily spiral out of control. And that was always the risk of the U.S. continuing this occupation of Syria. You got Russia there, you got Iran there, just a lot of tripwires for war. Spanish newspaper reports that the CIA spied on Ecuador's former president. So this article is from Consortium News. And this is interesting. Spanish private security company UC Global allegedly spied for the United States Central Intelligence Agency on meetings held between former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa and leaders of several Latin American countries in 2018. El País has reported, that's the Spanish newspaper. So according to the paper, the security company spied in particular on Correa's meetings with Argentina's former president, Brazil's former president, and Uruguay's former president. And this information emerged from an examination of the MacBook laptop belonging to David Morales, former military officer and owner of UC Global. So this is the guy who was spying on Julian Assange, the owner of this private security company. And it's pretty clear now that he was doing so at the behest of the CIA. And this was when Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy. And it was the president at the time, Rafael Correa, who gave him, what do you call? Sorry, I'm blanking on the word here. But he let Assange stay in the embassy. And it looks like the CIA was also spying on him. So this is a big deal because when it comes to the case against Julian Assange, if the CIA, if the U.S. government was spying on Assange and, recording his meetings with lawyers and advocates and everything, I mean, the case against him should be thrown out, you would think. So this evidence should be enough to get it dismissed and get Assange out of jail. But unfortunately, that's not the case. He's still awaiting, I guess, the appeal of the extradition decision from the UK. But this, should be very important to that case. So hopefully, more and more revelations about this guy, David Morales, and his company leads to the courts in the UK deciding that, there's been too much, U.S. spying on him to extradite him. But, unfortunately, I don't expect the British to make the right decision on this.
Weaknesses have been exposed by Prigozhin's mutiny, but I think even more deeply than that, they've been exposed by Putin's misjudgment since he launched this invasion as well. And I think there's a relationship between the battleground in Ukraine and what's going on inside Russia, in the sense that if and when the Ukrainians make further advances on the battlefield, I think what that's going to do is cause more and more Russians in the elite and outside the elite to pay attention to Prigozhin's critique of the war. Putin is someone who generally thinks that revenge is a dish best served cold, so he's going to try to settle the situation to the extent he can. But again, in my experience, Putin is the ultimate apostle of payback. So I would be surprised if Prigozhin escapes further retribution for this. So in that sense, the president's right. If I were Prigozhin, I wouldn't fire my food taster.
Why should the chief spy be making statements like that in front of an audience that he knows will receive them well?
He shouldn't. It sort of is the epitome of his having become a propagandist. And that's exactly what a director of the CIA.
That is so, I know you're going to agree with me, Ray. That is so dangerous for the head of the CIA and thus the people that work for him to become propagandists. That assures, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that the president will only hear the intel that the people telling him think he wants to hear.
Well, that's correct. And it's also correct of the military. I mean, you have a Secretary of Defense now, Austin, who, when head of CENTCOM in Tampa, the command that's responsible for activities in the Middle East, 51 of his intelligence analysts, I think maybe it was 52, okay, formally complained to the Pentagon Inspector General that Austin and his chief lieutenants, his generals up there, were falsifying the intelligence that the young people were sending up. Syria was a wreck. It was not going to be a win for the West, so to speak, and a loss for Assad. So he's got a record of this. If he knows what the president wants to hear, he's going to tell him that Burns might be a guy like that. Let me add just one thing so people know about Burns. I used to respect him. I've met him when he was ambassador to Russia, February 2008. Here's just two sentences out of a cable he wrote back to Washington. Now Bush and Cheney were in charge. Quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years, conversations with Russian key players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have find no one who views Ukraine in anything as anything other than a direct challenge, direct provocation to Russian interests. Now, why do I say that? End quote. Okay. Well, now, 15 years later, what's Bill Burns saying? Unprovoked, no provocation. Putin drove his armies into Ukraine without provocation. He's a bad, bad, bad guy. And I know because I'm the head of CIA. Give me a break. Can you forget stuff like that in 15 years? I don't think so. He's a propagandist, and he's telling the president what the president wants to hear. And so he gets promoted to the cabinet on those merits. God help us all.
Who did what to whom?
Well, Judge, before the little interruption there, you talked about how do you explain the Russians shooting down the grain deal? And you yourself have corrected yourself in the past. The Russians didn't shoot down the grain deal. They renewed it for a couple of months, several times. What happened? Well, the West didn't live up to the terms of the grain deal. Part of that was to relieve some sanctions on what the Russians were able to do with their shipping, and that didn't happen. So, long story short, the Russians were diddled again. Now, there's more to it than that. Odessa is being bombed to smithereens, one of the main ports exporting these grain deals. What's the West going to do? Now, Zelensky wants the Turks to escort, break the blockade. The Turks said, "I thank you very much. We don't want to get involved with Russia that way." Is the West going to help Zelensky try to defy these new regulations in the Black Sea? I don't know, but it's very, very volatile there because there are ships and there are people taking pot shots at bridges, and all manner of things that can happen in the Black Sea to no one's good.
So what becomes of the grain now? This is Ukrainian grain, is it not? Or grain grown and harvested in Ukraine?
Yeah, I guess the Russians have reserved the right to inspect all ships going into Ukrainian ports, and that takes a while. Sometimes they find stuff. There's some recent reports about gunpowder or some sort of explosive powder on one of those ships. So it's going to delay things. The Russians have their own way of exporting grain. They have a bumper crop. So it's something of a fiction to say that the people who really need it and the people who the Russians ship to will be deprived of what they need to eat. It's complicated, but the main thing is that in the Black Sea and up toward Belarus and Poland, there are fires brewing. There are demonstrative gestures to say this far, but no farther, according to Putin. And I just learned this morning, Shoigu, the defense minister, is off to North Korea for consultations. Whoa!
Wait a minute. Why would the Russian defense minister be in North Korea? What could the North Koreans possibly supply to the Russians?
Well, they don't need supplies from North Korea. What they need to do is just round up all the likely suspects. Okay, get all the people who are allies of Russia and China in this confrontation, line them all up and say, look, we don't know what the U.S. is going to do. I, Vladimir Putin, have called these people crazy for perpetrating or risking a two-front war against not only us, but China, and you guys are also involved. It could be. So look, let's make it very clear that if NATO, if the collective West does something really egregious, that they do face a two-front war. And that might mean they would have to do some exercises that are even more provocative than the ones you've done heretofore.
Well, getting back to the American propagandist in chief, here's the president in Helsinki right after the conference in Vilnius 2 weeks ago, trying to do his best to make a simple declaratory statement that Russia, in his view, has lost the war.
There's no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine. He's already lost that war. Imagine anyway, he's already lost that war.
Now, do you think, I know you're not a shrink, he honestly believes that? He honestly believes that? Or Bill Burns and company have given him such propaganda that it seems credible?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive, of course.
Correct.
I think the latter is quite true. It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what Putin believes. He's already called these people crazy. What is he to think about his opposite number with his fingers on the codes for nuclear weapons in this kind of shape? I regret to say that were I Putin, I would prepare for the worst and I would have my retaliatory forces on trigger alert. I mean, what would these crazy people advise Biden to do next, and how close would he be to say, well, that makes sense, and it mumble through what the justification in quotes would be for the American people? This is really strange. It's really very dangerous. And as I say, it all depends on how not only Putin, but his military look at these things. And the military, of course, looks at capabilities, not intentions. So if the capability of the U.S. is to notch up the escalation, to send F-16s, which even the U.S. is now backtracking on, that would be a nuclear capable aircraft to be shot down by superior Russian aircraft. I hold no brief for Russian superiority, but it's there, folks. It's there. Not only in the conventional sense, it's there in a strategic sense for the first time since the Cold War began. Mark my words, they have hypersonic capabilities we do not have. And if the balloon goes up, God help us, they're not in a position to sit back and say, well, okay, we'll just take it.
He admitted that's why we sent them as a bridge till the artillery shells arrive, the cluster bombs.
Yeah, Judge, the point is this. Why don't we have basic ammunition for artillery? The reason is that the Soviet Union fell apart 32 years ago. It was no threat. You couldn't persuade the Germans even to build new tanks because there's no threat from Russia. What happened? In 2014, we did a coup on Russia's periphery. We had been warned Ukraine should not be part of NATO. The new coup leaders we put in said, let's become part of NATO. That's when it started, the 22nd of February, 2014, not the 23rd, not a month later, when their main naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea was annexed to Russia. So if you don't know that, how many years, 14 to, well, that's 9 years ago. That's when it all started.
But now the big issue is should the Republicans now impeach Biden? And there's a couple positions you could take there. The first thing is I don't think it should be hard for anybody that is outside the inner circle of Biden that ought to be investigated to find out. The stories coming out now, and the Republicans who are arguing now that there's been a tremendous benefit by the Republicans, even with a narrow margin. Maybe narrow margins are a good way to handle things. Yeah. Getting control of the Congress and looking into this. So the evidence now and the hearings, I think in many ways this past weekend was a big deal, but it continues to get big, and there's more talk of having an impeachment. I'm sort of reserved on impeachment. I don't think impeachment. They say they wouldn't have to do a whole lot more. We have the evidence. Next week, let's vote on impeachment. I think that that's not going to work, because one thing for sure is impeachment has been grossly distorted compared to 1974. 1974, just the thought of a possible impeachment. It's just the thought that the evidence may lead to that. It's just the thought that Republicans were agreeing with Democrats. Big difference, and they were much more civil. But now if there seems like there's plenty of justification for a real investigation, so why doesn't the DOJ do that? Well, who believes in the DOJ? And I mean, the people that need to investigate is the FBI right now. You know, this whole thing. So it's not easily done. And an inquiry, looking into and getting more evidence, whether it's done in 6 days or 6 weeks or whatever, I think long term, it's the truth that we want.
Because we both read this from the Federalist, and it's an interesting article by Margot Cleveland. She's their chief legal reporter. The title is "Only an Impeachment Inquiry Can Unravel Biden Family Corruption and the Fed's Role." And I think she's making the case that you're making, because I think what you're saying, Dr. Paul, is boom, boom, impeachment and done is really not going to do the job, because what we need to know is we need to find out exactly what was going on in a nonpartisan way. That's not what we got with Trump. As you say, it was totally 100% partisan. Ironically, some of the things he was accused of, it looks like Biden may have actually done. You remember when Hillary's server information came out, and she's having all these emails in her bathroom, highly confidential. Remember what Bernie Sanders did? He didn't say, hey, let's get her, this is bad. He said, I don't care about Hillary's emails. He basically gave up on that. Well, RFK Jr. did not do that yesterday. He said, we need to investigate the Bidens and find out what's going on. That's a big change. It says a lot about his character, but also says a lot about the realities in the Democratic Party right now. And the other thing, Dr. Paul, I would say the other shoe to drop is Devon Archer. And this was Hunter's business partner. They were involved with Burisma Energy in Ukraine, this oligarch company that was paying the brilliant Hunter Biden, great painter, humanitarian. They're paying him $80,000 a month because he was so brilliant. The partner is now facing serious jail time for some of the other stuff that he's done. So it sounds like he's going to go and testify before Congress to give some information and try to keep himself out of boiling water. I would hate to be him right now because it might be dangerous, but I think that really is the other shoe to drop, because, we had, was it Bobulinski his name was, and he got a little bit of info, but everyone knows Devon Archer. Everyone knows he was the main partner. So if he comes out with some serious information and he's suggesting and he's teasing that he has some big stuff, it could be really bad, because this is what's going to happen here in a few days, and it's going to be big. Because you remember what President Biden said. I never spoke to anyone that dealt with my son in business. I had nothing to do with his business whatsoever. He's just relying on his inner brilliance. Well, doesn't look to be the case. Here's Miranda Devine's piece in the Post. Hunter Biden put then VP dad Joe on the phone with business associates at least 24 times. Ex-partner Devon Archer to testify. He would repeatedly get his dad on the horn, put him on speakerphone. Obviously, his dad is the vice president of the United States. That is a little bit more than just Joe Blow. Put the next one up, because this is the detail from Miranda's piece. Hunter Biden would dial in his father, then VP Biden, on speakerphone into meetings with his overseas business partners, according to testimony expected this week from Devon Archer. Archer, as we mentioned, is facing jail for his role in a $60 million bond fraud. He's scheduled to testify to the House Oversight Committee. He's trying to keep his bacon out of jail, which one would understand, no question about it. But the main thing, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, about the Burisma thing that's so important is that, this company was being investigated by their prosecutor, their chief prosecutor in Ukraine. and the interference was made after some bribes were paid. These are the allegations. Some bribes were paid by the owner of this company, by the head of this company, a fellow called Zlochevsky. $10 million is the claim, and Senator Grassley released this information. Here's $10 million. You got to get rid of this guy. He's looking into our corruption. We don't like this at all. And so not only did Biden make sure the guy was gotten rid of, he actually bragged about it in this famous clip that we should show. It's a minute long if we can put it on. Now there is one bad word in there, but that's typical of Biden. But if put that first clip on in here, where he's so dumb that he admits that he committed something that's way worse than anything Trump has done. You might want to put your earplug in here, Dr. Paul, and listen to what he's having to say.
I'll give you one concrete example. But it just happened to be, that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there's another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. I think it was, 6 hours? I said, leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
Two funny things about this. First of all, I think that laughter among the other two was kind of nervous laughter, because this is a case where he's admitting to a crime. Like, what? Should be quiet. He's literally saying, if you don't call the dogs off of this company that my son's working for, you don't get $1 billion. And here he is just admitting it.
It's almost like he self-indictment.
Yeah.
That should be all that's necessary.
Yeah, so there's this. There's 24 times he called his dad, hey, get on the phone, Dad. I got to get this deal going. So it doesn't look good for him, and will remain it'll remain to be seen. Like you say, will some Dems get on board and say, look, this guy is a disaster for us? Well, I think here's the other thing we were going to talk about if we put the next one on. So even Kevin McCarthy, who's despite how he would like to style himself, is really not a radical bomb thrower by any stretch of the imagination. Even he is saying, he's comparing Biden to Nixon and saying a congressional probe will rise to impeachment inquiry. And if you go to the next one, he actually is telling the truth here. And here's what he says. We would know none of this if Republicans hadn't taken the majority, he said. Congressional Republicans have been probing Biden since they took over the House in January. McCarthy said amplifying the probe of Biden to an impeachment inquiry would give Congress the strongest power to get the rest of the knowledge and information needed. And I think to that, not to put words in your mouth, he would say yes, but be cautioned. Use caution.
When I think about this in the big picture of money being stolen and corruption and money under the table, and then you compare it to what we have made legal. Just think of all the illegalities that go on and the redistribution of wealth, how they can take it and move it from one group to another group because another group either wants it or demands it, or they have a political clout to do it. And a lot of people refer to that, and I do too, as it's plunder. And yet that is okay because it was done by a Democratic Congress. They voted for this, and this is the one reason why this dictatorship of the majority doesn't work. But they have done that for years. But that is where the big thing is. And if we looked at the current events right now, the current event, or what the military-industrial complex has done, the pharmaceutical industry, the social media, what they've accomplished, and the collusion with government, these are big things, and so much of it they consider perfectly illegal, especially the transfer of wealth. I think people are starting to feel it and understood it, and it never seemed to hurt me when I was campaigning, is that poor people suffer because there's a monetary system that is corrupt. So you can say, yeah, there's a lot of corruption here, and it's bad, and I'm not going to ever belittle this because people can see this, but I would like to see a time when people see the immorality of a transfer society that is using the dictatorship of a majority, and all you have to do is have a loud voice to say, oh, we need people, we need help for people, and if you're not for it, if you're not for the military complex, or if you're not for the pharmaceutical companies, then you're un-American and you're an evil person. So we have a long way to go with the big picture, and this is something that is not going to be attended to this year.
Yeah. Can't trust the Department of Justice, and there's so many questions now about Merrick Garland. How many handcuffs did he put on investigators and whistleblowers, not allowing them to get into this investigation of Hunter Biden? What else did he do? Now we know the FBI has been shown to have been less than on the up and up in this whole thing as well. We've got whistleblowers from the FBI talking about it. So the question is, can we trust the federal government? And I think the answer is pretty obvious right now. So there needs to be an inquiry. So when we're saying it may backfire, we're not saying, hey, just let it go, just drop. We're saying that be careful because this is some dangerous ground.